Our next panel, I am just delighted to introduce to you. I'll have Chad share with you a little bit more as to what the purpose of this grant is, but we were very fortunate in July of 2017 to be awarded a Pay for Success grant that will allow us to explore employers' attitudes towards employing people on the autism spectrum. And this is, in our opinion, really kind of the missing piece to solving the puzzle of getting people employed out there in our community. So I'm going to turn it over to Chad and just really thank this panel. It has been delightful. It's the favorite time of my week is when we get together for 2 hours and really explore in in extreme depths as to what this looks like. So without further ado, Chad.
Thank you for that introduction, and I'll do an introduction as well. So I am Chad Salvadore from the Sorenson Impact Center at the David Eckel School of Business at the University of Utah. And as Christy had mentioned, we've been fortunate to, for about the last 9 months or so, been able to work with Columbus to explore this program, which our panelists will talk about here in just a second. So I will briefly introduce all of them and then turn it over to them since they are the real brains on this stage. And so first we have Tyler Hardy, who is the engagement manager at the Cicero group. Genevieve Smith, the chief data management officer here at Columbus Community Center. John Davis, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Educational Psychology at the University of Utah. And finally, Nick Fritz, who is a senior associate also with the Sorenson Impact Center. So they are going to cover the topic of innovations in impact investing, specifically related to disabilities, told through the Columbus Community Center project to try to investigate this issue area for the next work program. So with that, I will turn it over to the panelists to present a little bit about the project.
Thanks, Chad. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that good? Okay. Hi, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we're doing, that the Sorenson Impact Center is doing with the Columbus Community Center and exploring next work as a candidate for what we call a Pay for Success transaction, or really an outcomes-based financing transaction. So I'm going to kind of level set on what that exactly means and talk a little bit about what is the benefit of this kind of outcomes-based transaction. And then I'll hand it over to the rest of the panel to talk more deeply about the project and what we're learning. So you've probably heard the term Pay for Success before, potentially. These sort of outcomes-based transactions come in, are built many ways. In Utah, we have several of these Pay for Success transactions live, and that's how they're referred to them in the state. But more globally, these can be referred to as social impact bonds or go by a number of names. So I may, as we're talking, we may use the kind of terminology interchangeably, so don't be confused. Outcomes-based financing, Pay for Success, social impact bond, all largely the same thing. So let me just talk through at a high level sort of what that all means. So the traditional kind of Pay for Success model is what you see on the screen. So it starts with investors, and these are sort of non-traditional investors in the public service space. So these are folks who, potentially they're investment bankers, potentially they are foundations, who are putting up kind of the upfront working capital to run a program at a service provider or at a number of service providers. So those service providers provide the service to whoever it is. In this case, of course, it's transition age youth with autism. And the evaluator is kind of the next kind of critical piece of this transaction, right? So what the evaluator does is they study the intervention that the service provider is providing and determine whether or not, or what effect it had really on the people whom they're serving. And then finally, and this is where sort of the magic of this transaction is that based on the results of that evaluation, typically a government pays back that investor. So if the results are sort of as expected, the investor gets paid back with typically a little bit of interest to compensate them for the risk they took. And if the results are not as positive as expected and don't meet sort of agreed upon thresholds, that investor does not get paid back. So in the course of this transaction, we learn something about the nature of the service itself, and we can really definitively say whether or not the service provided the effect intended. Now, let's say, hypothetically, the service or the evaluation does not find that there was the effect that was kind of expected. That is, although the investor doesn't get paid back for that sort of term, still that is a valuable transaction because it's information for the service provider to sort of feed back in and better understand how their program is working and move toward producing that effect. And then in the middle of all of this complicated transaction, typically there's an intermediary which sort of brings all the parties to the table and manages this complicated work. So you may ask, I just alluded to some of the benefits of this, but this is a really complicated and difficult transaction. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the core tenets that bring folks to the table to do this work. And the first that so frequently gets lost in these kind of whiz-bangy conversations about pay for success and this great new financial model is ultimately that all of the players are at the table to improve outcomes for disadvantaged folks in our communities who are really facing these intractable problems. The impetus for all of this kind of social impact bond and pay for success work in the US and elsewhere is to move the needle on these problems that seem to be really sticky, and we seem to throw a lot of resources at them without any real movement. So that really is the core motivation. Now, there are some kind of specific tenets that draw all of these disparate outcomes-based financing transactions together. So I want to talk through just a couple of those sort of briefly. The first is knowledge creation, right? So in the course of this evaluation and sort of feedback loop that now we have at the service provider level, we are creating real knowledge about what effect the what effect the service is having, and that knowledge that we're creating kind of limits uncertainty, right? We have a much better sense at the end of this of how the service provided an effect and what effect it provided. This kind of limited uncertainty unlocks all new funding streams for this space, right? When we can say definitively whether or not there was an effect, and we can kind of create a financial product around that, we're unlocking kind of the power of the capital markets here to bring in the trillions of dollars that's kind of floating around in the open capital markets into the social sector. And ultimately, the benefit of all of these type of transactions is that governments and funders pay only for programs that work, and in that way we can scale really effective programs to move the needle on these sticky problems. So those are kind of high level why we like PFS. And I'm going to turn it over to the rest of my panel, to Genevieve now, to talk a little bit about the service provider perspective.
Thanks, Nick. Is this a good level? Can you hear me? So something I'm really excited about, especially with these pay for success frameworks, data science and really talking about outcomes and proving causality is kind of a new idea in the social sector. I think for years and years and years we've tied these lines between intervention and what's happening on the ground for these populations, but we haven't had the resources to really prove causality because we live in a very reactive, resource-poor world. And this, I like to think about these as the sort of positive externalities of the Pay for Success framework and these conversations around outcomes-based financing, specifically for us, Columbus. So this project is specific to Next Work, our employer engagement and finding employment improving employment outcomes for young adults with autism. But we have a number of other programs, and what's really exciting about this is permeating the rest of the agency. Next Work is one of 8 programmatic departments that we have, and what's been really neat about this is it's given us that intellectual space and intellectual safety to really experiment and say, okay, well, we know about state funding, we know about grants, and we know how those have worked for the last 50 years, right? But we've sort of pigeonholed ourselves in that thinking, and this has really given us the space to open up and say, well, what if this works? And if it doesn't, that's okay. And that's really exciting in our world, because we don't get to do that very often. That impact measurement and idea about, well, wait, how do we measure this, and can we experiment a little bit, that's gone far and beyond the Next Work program, which is incredibly exciting. And we've got a great multidisciplinary team. It's cross-sector in terms of we've got the employer perspective, we're working with great people in academia, and then we've got that provider perspective. And that's something that has been really wonderful at these meetings, this sort of cross-sector and multidisciplinary approach to all of this, and we're all able to kind of push and pull on each other a little bit. And that has also permeated the agency, and I know it's permeated the rest of my work and the other teams that I work on. And ultimately, that all gets to this new approach to problem solving, because, Columbus, we've been at this is our 50th year. We've got the social services piece of this pretty much down. There's a lot of great research on that social services piece, but we really started looking at this as a workforce development issue, and that was a paradigm shift for us. We know that sort of N equals 1, follow the individual, what does the service look like? And I think there tends to be this sort of, we talk about the service cliff for folks who are aging out of the school district, but I think that also exists with, well, what happens when the individual leaves the provider? And something that we've found, and this came from research that Cicero did, so many workforce development providers think that their individuals that they're serving are really well prepared to enter the workforce. I think it was 72% of providers surveyed said, yes, these guys are prepared to enter the workforce. When we look at employers, it was 42%. So that's a huge, huge gap. And so something that we've been working on is, well, how do we bridge that? And that kind of gets back to the multidisciplinary idea too, trying to get out of our echo chambers of, well, we know what works. We've been doing this for 50 years, which we do, but there's that extra piece of bridging this gap. So what I tried to do here, ask anybody I work with, I have a lot of whiteboards with arrows, and so I tried to simplify this as much as I could, but really thinking about this as sort of a supply and demand issue. So we know that there's a low unemployment rate statewide, but a high unemployment rate for individuals with autism and individuals with disabilities in general. So we know there are people who can work and who are looking for work, and we know that there are jobs available. What's happening between those two things? And this gets back to that sort of shifting the way we're thinking about problems. We were so focused on what we were good at that pay for success and outcomes-based financing really opened up that intellectual space to say, no, let's go somewhere where we don't quite know what we're doing. And in the research that we've done, both primary and secondary, we found that this is something a lot of people struggle with. It's a huge communication gap between providers and individuals and employers. So we're trying to get to that by where do the outcomes live? The outcomes, in terms of this project, we're thinking about employment outcomes. So specifically for Next Work, we talk about sustainable, good fit employment. A lot of employment programs for people with disabilities have been focused on, the retail sector, the food service sector, which is not inherently negative at all, but turnover is high, retention is tough. What happens when your manager moves on and they haven't dealt with people with disabilities, and maybe the relationship was good for 3 months and all of a sudden it's not? And something we run into is we're not funded through that. So how do we pick those people back up? And how do we think about retention as well? That's every conversation we have about employment outcomes. The first thing people say is, well, let's measure retention. Okay, how? and that gets back to being sort of resource constrained, and there are great models to measure retention if you've got 10 grad students for 2 years. But in the social sector, we're not going to get there, and this has sort of given us the opportunity to figure out how to bridge that gap. And then there's also, we talk a lot about cost savings. Sorenson built a wonderful cost-benefit analysis model. And actually, I should mention, in the back room, Nextwork has a table where we've got some of the literature about the research that we've done in terms of these cost savings. But really, we're talking about community inclusion. And we talk a lot about, well, what can we measure? How do we prove causality? And all of those things are important, but they're a proxy for community inclusion. And are we accomplishing our mission? And so with that, these guys are going to get a little bit in the weeds on a survey and interviews that we've been doing, because that communication piece is so huge. We've been missing that employer voice. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to John and Tyler.
Maybe? Great. So, as Genevieve iterated, employers are a critical piece to solving this problem in workforce development with individuals with autism. And I think it's important that you should all know you're catching us midstream in this research process. And so we just have finished up some initial interviews and are now fielding a quantitative survey. And so we're sharing early insights on what we're hearing. So more conclusive results are to come, but I think it's important to share what we've learned so far. So leading up to some of the primary data collection that we did, there was quite a bit of secondary research and understanding the landscape for employers here in the state of Utah with respect to hiring individuals with autism, and understanding what are the opportunities, the industries, the types of jobs that might be best fits for them. And we used that funnel to narrow down who we might go talk to, at least for the interviews initially. So we spoke with individuals in tech, financial service, manufacturing, and a few others that seemed like good fits for individuals with autism. And there was evidence outside the state that also led us to believe that they might be good employers as well. So what did we hear? First, surrounding awareness. When we talk to employers around diversity in their workforce, disabilities is rarely on the list. Even lower on that list is autism. And so there's a severe gap in what they consider a part of their, and priority in their diversity initiatives. And it's often, if it is included, it comes and goes, depending on leadership, depending on where they're at in the life cycle of their business. And so it's important to know that there's an education piece, which we actually heard in the last panel, that needs to happen with these employers to make them aware and help them understand what the opportunities are for individuals with autism as a part of their workforce, and that they are included in that diversity initiative. Second thing we learned is when prompted, when given the education, when they understand the types of roles that an individual with autism might be able to fill, the skill set that they could bring to the table, they can start spouting off potential opportunities for them, roles that they might be able to fill, analyst roles, software engineer roles, across the board, they can think of the opportunities. So it's just a matter of helping them connect those dots and understanding where people might fit within the organization. Again, hinging on that they're aware and that they're educated of the capabilities of individuals with autism. The other thing we explored throughout our interviews and we heard is employers are willing to make some accommodations to hiring individuals with autism. This includes in the interview process as well as on the job. The trick to making this happen, though, is this hard-fought discussion around disclosure, that individuals with autism and as job candidates are really hesitant to disclose in the interview process that they may need the support, that they may need an accommodation. And you could chalk that up to past experience might have taught them that they shouldn't be disclosing because it might ding them in the process. But employers, at least initially what we're hearing, is are open to that and want to hear that and are willing to make accommodations in appropriate ways. They still want to be able to ensure they can professionally and accurately evaluate a candidate and will hold them to the same sort of standards, but that they can make sure that they're seeing the best of the candidate in whatever process meets their needs. And leading into that, once they're on the job, an individual with autism will be held to the same standards as a neurotypical employee. So while accommodations can be made within reason, they're still going to expect the same level of efficiency, the same level of output, and same level of productivity. And they're going to hold them to that standard, and in part because that's just the nature of their business, that they have priorities in terms of making sure that they're hitting their goals. And then finally, and probably most encouragingly for our program, what we heard from employers as we introduced this idea of a workforce development program that might create a supply of individuals with autism as a part of their workforce, was that they're interested in it. They want to learn more. They're willing to host workshops with a provider, even in Columbus, to come and educate them on these issues so that they can recognize this untapped talent that they might be able to leverage in their company. And so it's encouraging, and it was great to hear these initial takeaways, and it was helpful to kind of hear from the voice of the customer in this case, or technically the employer, and use this as design for going into and validating this quantitatively, which would be John.
So, I'm John Davis. I'd like to start my presentation by thanking Columbus for allowing me to be part of this this great project. It's been fantastic for me to be part of your mission and to help develop this program. So, as we've said, within the Pay for Success framework, it's really important to bring employers into the process. We're following momentum that's happening within this field by starting with the end goal. You know, what are the jobs? What are the skills needed? Rather than how we've approached education. And I'm at a university with kind of a train and hope model where we give them skills and we hope they're going to generalize to the job market. Now, what we know about individuals with autism is that generalization, or taking the skill they learn in one environment and applying it in a novel environment later, doesn't necessarily connect well. So we need to be more directive and more thoughtful in how we do that. So one way to do that is to go into the community and talk to employers and see what skills they say they need. They need. You know, what are the specific skills of the job, and can we help just connect individuals to those, or train those that don't that maybe have a deficit in a certain area. So we need to figure out what employers are telling us. You know, is there a place in the landscape of Utah employment for individuals with autism? Now, we know that there's record low unemployment in general, and we know that that's disproportionate to the individuals on the spectrum. You know, they're not employed at the same rates as their neurotypical peers. So there's a big group that could potentially fill this need in Utah employment. So we looked to employers to see whether or not there was a place for individuals here in Utah. And we had a lot of help from a lot of different contacts within the state, the Utah Employers Council, Salt Lake City Chamber of Commerce, South Salt Lake City Chamber of Commerce, Utah Technology Council, the Governor's Office of Economic Development, Women's Tech Council, and Newmont College, and others, for connecting with businesses to get perspective. With these surveys, we targeted decision makers in business, so corporate leadership, HR managers, and we wanted to get their feedback on what the landscape looked like, or what potential positions were for individuals with autism. So a little graph on who we surveyed. Mostly hiring personnel, mostly those that did supervising employees, had some part of their job training employees, some doing risk management. For the most part, these are decision makers who are the people that are going to be the gateway for individuals coming in the company. So corporate leadership down to the hiring decision makers. And we intentionally cut off the survey respondents at that point. So if you didn't have a role within any of these areas, that's where the survey ended. So a variety of industries were represented. We wanted to get a full view of Utah and what the opportunities are in the state. And so we were fortunate with our partners who disseminated the survey to get a real broad view of the landscape for individuals with autism. So one of the pieces that we were trying to discover is what does what does diversity mean in corporate Utah at this point? I mean, is there an openness to having a diverse workforce, and what does that diversity look like? Because there's a lot of different ways to be diverse and think about diversity, and where does autism spectrum disorder fit into that? So interestingly, what we saw is there's a real openness to mental health diversity. A fair amount of our respondents talked about having depression and having anxiety, having trauma represented in their companies. That was the lion's share of the respondents, which is great that there's an openness to mental health difficulties, and maybe outside of the scope of what we're doing, maybe need more mental health services. But what we didn't see was a lot of acknowledgement of autism spectrum disorder as something that was considered in the diversity landscape as they considered potential hiring. So that's a point where we can think about education. What could we offer the company that for a person with ASD, and how can we connect them in the workforce, because they're willing and ready to meet the company's needs. So our next, beyond exploring what diversity means, we needed to see if there was a home for individuals with autism in companies. And so we approached this indirectly. So asking directly a person with any savvy in hiring or leadership in a company, will you hire an individual with an autism spectrum disorder? They would probably say yes, because if they don't, there's a word for that, discrimination, which is not something that people want to admit to. So we had to kind of allow ourselves to get a more honest answer in that. So we did that by providing vignettes. So we presented a spectrum of vignettes with key differences in how we described ability or intelligence, how we described their sensory needs, and how we described their social skills. So on a spectrum of higher to lower intelligence, social skills, sensory needs, knowing that these don't necessarily describe any one person, but describe common core characteristics of an individual with ASD. And then we asked, do you see a place for a person like this in your company? So we had them respond with open-ended answers on what kind of positions do you see for this person? So this person is of average intelligence, does well at nonverbal tasks, gets nervous when they speak in groups, and various core features that were consistent with autism. So what does that look like? This was a real open question for us. Is there anywhere for this individual to land? Can a hiring person see this description and think, yeah, I can connect the dots for this person, and they might fit in my industry. And what is really encouraging is that there's a lot of opportunities. There's a ton of opportunities, and these are all, and this isn't even all that we have. So employers in Utah see positions for individuals on the spectrum with a variety of needs. Now it's different for the different vignettes we did. This is just for the particular vignette that I displayed, but this is really encouraging. These are our positions that are in and ready to go, and what's also encouraging is this covers a broad spectrum of earning capacity for individuals on the spectrum. So there's a lot of opportunities, up to 80K plus a year jobs for an individual that was described. So that's really encouraging. So what that means is we need to make those connections. We need to work hard to, as Carmen Pingree said earlier, reach out and maybe have a tough skin and make those connections with people that see potential for individuals in this population. So as we said, lessons learned here is there are a lot of opportunities, and there's a lot of opportunities for a lot of different individuals. We all know autism isn't just one thing, but employers are responding that they see potential positions across the spectrum. But we need to do outreach. We need to educate, and we need to think about the end goals of our employers and our community of employers as we connect them with our communities of individuals with need. So from here, we have some is this my part?
Take it.
Yeah, okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Sales pitch.
I'm going to take it away. We need more participants. You know, there's no end to the perspectives. We have this survey that's available that you can give anonymously. Following that, we would like for businesses to participate in more in-depth interviews so that we can, you know, really make sense and make good recommendations on the information we've gathered. And all of you that are in business in the category of leadership or hiring, if you could share our survey with other businesses in Utah, we'd be very appreciative. And we're doing a breakout session after the main sessions where we can give you information to do that.
And I just want to mention real quick, with that breakout session, I just want to point out Amy Wadsworth. She's in the back there. Hi, Amy. So Amy has been, she's built the Next Work program from the ground up. So she's done a ton of work on this and just a really beautiful job putting all of this together and really communicating with us about here's what works, here's what doesn't. And she will be in our breakout session as well for more of those programmatic questions, just to point that out.
Thank you for that, and we do encourage everyone to go to that breakout question, especially if there's not time to cover all the questions here now. So in just a second, we'll turn it over to the audience for questions, but one thing that I wanted to ask the panelists is, and this is, you know, sort of acknowledging the sharing of the early results from the study, which I think is fantastic, and there's a lot of great learnings in there. But when you think about improving employment situation among young adults with autism, going out and talking to employers seems like a really obvious first step. And I'm curious why that information was so lacking and how an outcomes-based financing project was a mechanism to help kind of illuminate that lack of information and help facilitate going out and collecting some of this information.
I can take a swing at that. So I can probably speak most intelligently about why the outcomes-based financing project was the right mechanism to solve that problem. So because the outcomes-based financing mechanism, the Pay for Success, is so focused on the outcomes, right, on being able to measure what effect the program had, a huge part of the building of these projects is kind of evidence building. Typically the intervention models that are great for PFS projects are ones that are really, really deeply backed by sort of a rich evidence base. And I think the fact is that these sort of employment models that we're talking about sort of lack that deep evidence base. So what we're able to do is sort of a building block of the outcomes-based financing work is to do that research and think deep thoughts about why these programs haven't been studied in the past, or potentially why their kind of effectiveness is in question. So I think that's why kind of the Pay for Success model is right.
Yeah, and I can give a provider perspective. I think two things. The social sector has sort of every sector has sort of operated in silos for a very long time, and so I think having that cross-sector collaboration is huge because, yeah, it is a really obvious thing, but I think some of these and this is just personal viewpoint, but some of these conversations are, yeah, we need employers' perspectives, but how are we going to get that? How do we get in the room? Do you know anybody? I don't know anybody, And so part of it is that social capital piece too. And then I also think we talk a lot about inclusion and diversity, and something that we've found is disabilities is not always included in that diversity piece, and it's not something that's talked about. So I think in doing a lot of this research, so much of it comes from the UK in the 90s in the service industry, and that's the data that we had to go off of. So I think part of it, I would argue that we've always known that information was lacking. We just didn't have a bridge to get there, and that's what this outcomes-based model, sort of evidence building, has given us.
Can I add a thought? So I would say the gap of why employers are so often excluded is because for so many workforce development programs, a job is not actually the outcome. And they get so focused on outputs, and those outputs being how many people did we train in our program, how many volunteer hours did we have, what's our curriculum, and we get so lost in checking those boxes that at the end of the day it's, oh yeah, and to what end? What is the outcome? Is it a job that they can be retained in for a long-term period? And I would say that it gets convoluted depending on the provider. So in academia and higher ed, a lot of times the job isn't the priority. At a lot of universities, it's retaining great talent, it's having a high ranking, it's a lot of different things. And so training to a job just isn't an outcome that people often think about, and you need the employers to be part of that.
Yeah, sure. John, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, I mean, the university model, with very few exceptions, I mean, you don't typically train for a specific job. So accreditation boards and, it's happening some more, but the expectation is you're supposed to generalize the skills and think critically and, learn communication skills, learn how to think, and that will then translate to jobs. And, it doesn't always in every case if you don't have some support to make that bridge. So that support has not been as well defined as it probably could have been. And so I think that we're coming to those conclusions now. We're not alone in the industry in thinking this, but it is new for some reason, which is kind of surprising.
Yeah. So one last question, and then I'll turn it over to the audience for your questions as well, is especially if there are those of you out there in the audience thinking, and some of this has resonated with you in thinking about how it can be applied to some of your own efforts. I'm curious if, from your respective positions, you could talk a little bit about what makes for good outcomes-based financing, and or what are the first kind of steps if you want to start progressing along that continuum.
I can go first on that one as well. So it sort of depends on which party you are to the potential transaction, but we've done at the Sorenson Impact Center, we've really done a number of these over the last few years in terms of thinking about, what projects are good for PFS and which maybe aren't. I would say of all of those projects, the common thread is all about sort of data, right? So at the provider level, frequently it's the capacity to be able to sort of think about what are my meaningful outcomes, what am I really trying to achieve, and not only that, I mean, most providers I think have a very good sense of that. The challenge comes in having kind of the systems in place to be able to systematically collect and analyze that data over time. That is one roadblock. I think it's a resource roadblock, or maybe kind of just the cultural inertia of the way that this industry has worked for a very long time. So that's one area that I think is sort of a common thread of PFS projects, and maybe a good place to start if this is a thing that you would like to pursue. I think related to data, and equally as important, is sort of the jurisdictions, governments, and other organizations' ability and willingness to share data that they have. So there is a tremendous amount of administrative data collected and kept sort of in various government bodies and various organizations. Frequently, this data is really, really useful in these transactions because what we can say is it sort of provides a control group without having to do primary data collection, right? Where we can say, this is the target population that we are trying to affect, young adults with autism. We know, based on this admin data that is already collected, what the sort of typical outcomes are, and then we can measure in our population how those outcomes differ, right? And it sounds so simple, but there is a real fear and lack of willingness to share that data. I think partially it's a compliance fear, and partially it's sort of a misunderstanding of what the data will be used for. But you know, at really all levels of this transaction, that component is critical and really can't be overstated, and often is the barrier that is the reason that we say yes or no, this is not a great BFS project.
Yeah, and I think fundamental to that, and Tyler mentioned this as well, but the difference between outputs and outcomes, I mean, and this gets back to that really changing the way that we think about our work and what we're doing. And I think, you know, an obvious example is, so you install 6 latrines in a West African village, and then you see that school enrollment goes up. Okay, so what? And I think that's the fundamental thing is asking so what, and not being scared to ask ourselves so what, and really challenge those assumptions, because everybody is doing this work from an altruistic place, right? We all want to do good, and I think it's taking that next step to say, okay, but are we doing good? It's not enough to just show up. What is the work that we're accomplishing? So your output in that example would be those 6 latrines. And if you're arguing that your outcome is increased enrollment, how do you prove that? And that gets into some really tough conversations, because when you've got people who are underpaid and under-resourced and you say, well, yeah, but how do you know? That can be a really hard conversation to have, but I'm excited. I think the sector is moving this way, and this outcomes-based financing is really pushing that along. But I think on the ground, it's also great because it doesn't have to be fancy. I mean, this is stuff that we can tally on a whiteboard or on a chalkboard. It's not advanced analytics. Data is information, and I think getting service providers across the industry to really understand, no, just track it and think about what you're doing and why you're doing it. And that makes us so much more intentional about what we're doing, and it's getting to that sort of proactive culture instead of a reactive culture. I think I would argue that's the foundation of this way of thinking about these problems.
Acknowledging that the outcomes are very difficult. You know, getting hired for a job requires a lot of different background factors that influence it. So if you have significant communication needs, or you need significant sensory modifications, or you have intellectual deficits, those are very hard to change, right? And so it's hard to do a study where you need 4, 5, 10 years of intervention in order to equip the person to get to the obvious outcome, which is employment. So being a little bit more patient with how we get to the end, I think is a good direction.
And I think that touches on another idea of it's really exciting that these conversations are happening between providers and funders, because we've wanted to get to these outcomes and we've wanted to understand how to measure these things. And for us to have a seat at the table with funders of, well, if you want us to measure that, you've got to pay for it. And that, I mean, that's a game changer. That changes the way that we can do our work, and it changes how efficiently we can move throughout this world.
Any questions from the floor? I think yeah, your hand was up first.
I'm interested in the vignette. The list of jobs that people said thumbs up to was fabulous, but what were the people's answers as to, no, I wouldn't hire this? What were the barriers to hiring?
Well, this was more prospective. They kind of, I guess we can deduce if they didn't see a position for this individual, you know, and maybe they saw positions for people that were different than this particular one, but they didn't necessarily see. But we don't really know the barriers or the thinking, except, we did have this question, which was whether or not they saw it was a was it an intelligence issue? Was it a communication issue, a social skills issue, a sensory needs, or none of the above for the reason that you might not hire that person? And what's interesting about that is that across the spectrum, regardless of intelligence, communication was the primary issue that employers saw as a hurdle. So communication skill, which is good because communication skills are more easily trainable than, IQ is static. So I think that's encouraging. That's something that we can move and work on.
Go right ahead.
Those are really exciting data, like it's actually tangible. So how deep is the data, or more to the point, was it deep enough that you could correlate between the industry and the job?
Well, we're hoping to get the N up to be able to do that. So that's a statistical power issue. So if we get enough surveys, we can disaggregate it that way. And I'm hopeful. I'm very hopeful. We need participating partners. I mean, at this point, we're not at we have a lot represented in like manufacturing, but not as many across all of the different areas that we have. So that's just continuing to push the survey out there, but we're hopeful to do that.
Question about maybe rural versus urban. So here in the Wasatch Front, probably where most of that research went on. You have an organization that's growing leaps and bounds like Silicon Slopes, and they're in demand for labor. So there's economic pressures for them to get more women in STEM and maybe ultimately hire some of these individuals. And then we just heard from Ginger Chin about the rural situation. I'm wondering if there are families that own ranches and farms that are trying to figure out how to get reliable labor to bring to Florida, maybe convert crops from corn to lavender, hydroponic farming. And there's an operation up in Jackson Hole that's a 4-story hydroponic vertical harvest is what it's called, and our 15 special needs individuals that live in Jackson Hole. Do you see opportunities there where it's just economics driving? It's a bit altruistic, but they need labor and can't get it in maybe some of these counties.
Well, I'll tell you, that's one of the real hopes of this is that we can, employers will gain the perspective that, hey, these are individuals that can contribute, and it's not charity to employ this individual. This person can contribute, and it can be beneficial on both sides, as a typical employment relationship would be. I mean, we're hopeful to get community rural perspectives on this, and we do have through the Qualtrics service, they do have information on where the survey was taken, so we could see if it occurs in rural. We don't know who you are, but it gives us the longitude and latitude of where you take it, so we can kind of see whether it's taken in, here, there, or wherever. Does that answer your question?
I just wanted to make a comment as a parent of an adult with autism. My husband and I moved out here from the Northeast, and transportation is probably the number one thing. You could say that your child is high functioning and can do many things, but if you could take the driver's ed test, go in and pass it just by looking at it, and pass it, but then actually applying driving skills is a whole different other kettle of fish. And we were fortunate enough when we moved out here, we had to make a decision of where we wanted to live, and we chose to live in the university because of the bus system. And our son has utilized that to a T. And it's been a savior for us. One is a social emotional component of his life, that he's able to be functioning in the city and interact in a way. And then secondly, just for him to be able to do some of the things he wants to do, just get along. He lives with us and will live with us till I don't know when, but him being able to be, and I guess that's the thing with a business as a parent, is where a business is located and businesses they choose. I mean, if they don't have public transportation to that particular business, especially wherever it is, whether it be on the west side or however it's set up, it's hard for us as parents, if we're still the main provider for our children with disabilities, to get our kids, or our adults rather, sorry, out that's just a component that, as a parent, when we are trying as a family to decide how our child looks at a job and makes a decision for a job, transportation is big.
Well, I can acknowledge from my interactions with the Office of Voc Rehab and Workforce Services in the state, that's the number one barrier for a lot of individuals is having reasonable, predictable transportation if it's not on a bus line. And I think that's part of the brilliance of how the hub was designed here at Columbus is that it is around transportation routes. And so for those that can't drive independently, or parents can't be the taxi driver for them, they have some ability to access independence with transportation. But yeah, it is an issue, and it's certainly not yours alone. It's a real barrier.
Yeah, and just to reiterate that's a huge idea behind the hub, that it's transit. No. So it's just going to be down the street, 39th and West Temple, and it's multi-use, transit-oriented, so market rate housing, affordable housing, housing for people with disabilities, and is it 16, Stephanie? Units for young adults with autism. And the Next Work Academy will be housed in the hub. And so folks using residential services and attending the Next Work program, as well as just attending the Next Work program, will be at the hub right by the Meadowbrook station. And the idea of that is, place-based solutions are huge. But I also think that speaks to this idea of problem solving. So that's kind of us approaching that from the provider standpoint, but then how do they get to work? And is the business on the tracks line, and what does that look like? And we have explored, state funding for transportation and what that might look like. But that's also, when we talk about accommodations, if you look at Silicon Valley, Google and Facebook have buses that they transport their employees with from San Jose to San Francisco. So I think that's something to explore in terms of accommodations. And this gets back to having disabilities be a part of that diversity conversation, because diversity, it could be folks who don't have a car and they bike to work, so are there bike lockers there, and sort of bringing that in. This is not an extra accommodation, you're already doing this for a lot of your employees, so it's not that sort of extra calories.
There's a beautiful image of the building back there at the back of the room as well for you to take a look at too. So I think we've got time for one last question.
If I may, there's a lot of talk about the data that this survey creates and reluctance of organizations and people to give up their data to enrich this study. I'd like to understand what your thoughts are on future data sets that you'd like to bring to bear on this study, considering things like transportation, and then the analyses that you might do, what the future holds for this that might give us some if-then, what-if scenarios.
I think it's, for me and in the work that I do, it's really easy to sort of cast a wide net and say, well, we want all of the data we can possibly get. But there's also a really great conversation in this space about data minimization, and we should only collect what we can protect and what we're planning on using, which again makes us very intentional about how we're designing the program and how we're designing, like what do we want to know now that we don't have information on? Okay, can we understand that in 10 years? And I think transportation is a big one. Retention is a huge one. That's something that I come back to constantly. But I think it also goes back to Nick's point of data sharing. And a lot of this information exists. It's just in silos, or it's in PDFs that are really hard to work with, or it's under some regulation. And so I think that's where I would like the sector to sort of start problem solving, is a lot of this data exists, we just can't get to it, or it's not talking to each other.
As you get questions answered, more pop up, and certainly with this was a first run at employer perspective, so there's a lot more questions that come up, things like what were the barriers for individuals with certain core conditions. We did a lot more fine grain, or we did more work on what are allowable accommodations or what are acceptable accommodations. And so it would be interesting to see how that differs by industries. You know, there are some industries that, you know, won't allow fragrances. They won't make that accommodation. You know, 30% of our respondents said they would not make that accommodation for an individual coming in. So figuring out why that is, you know, that's a pretty deep question. Why there are certain accommodations that are allowable in some environments and not others, and why expectations are made in certain industries and not others, or not accommodated for. So as we do this first run, we'll have a lot of questions that aren't unanswered. So this was just a small piece of the full survey, but there'll be more that we'll need to figure out so we can adequately direct people in the right direction. So it's probably a non-ending process, right? But I'm a data guy, so you know, that's the life I've chosen.
I would add to that. So I mentioned you're kind of catching us all midstream of this project, and so we're kind of defining or redefining the next work program, as well as finding what the outcome should be, and then the next step of that is what is the measurement evaluation process for that. And with any good social impact evaluation, you'll collect data to prove, but to also improve, right? And so as we think about how we're going to hopefully prove some outcomes, more importantly, we'll find that there's going to be a very iterative process of where we missed data or where we missed, and how we can collect data in the future to better prove or improve the program itself.
And you know, there are really clean outcomes of job and income. You know, how much are they getting paid, and do they have a job, and for how long? But the predictors of how we get to those real grand goals, that needs to be worked on. So how can we predict the success, and what can we do to inform curriculum and directing individuals towards the services they need to get that big goal of getting a job with an income that they're satisfied with?
So unfortunately, we're at time, so we'll end the conversation there. Big thank you to our panelists for